There is in our culture a deep suspicion of religious zeal. Imagine today's gospel passage were in the Quran. Some would fall over themselves, claiming Islam was inherently very dangerous indeed. When you look at our scriptures, the Bible and the Quran, we find both beautiful passages about peace and passages laying bare the violence at the abyss of the human heart. And it's often difficult to understand. We can only hazard a guess at the historical context.
But back to today's gospel passage. Abuse of religion and bad religion is not best fought with no religion, but with passion, with vision, with inspiration, with a faith that is spiritually alive in this way, as well as having intellectual integrity, an integrity that's open to critical discourse, to critical scholarship, and that's the hallmark of good theology. Closing our ears and pretending when we read the Bible that we still live in antiquity, and doing that without even bothering to inquire how our 21st century lens conceives of this, is not going to help. Biblical texts are multi-layered partners in conversation, partners from a very different age than ours, and our understanding will change and grow over time as our insights develop. This all sounds terribly theoretical, but it actually isn't. If we want to give good and useful and credible and profound answers to the questions of what it is to be a Christian and what it is to live a Christian life, we absolutely have to build any answers on these foundations.
First of all, Matthew's Gospel, as we find it, is written with the experience of Christian persecution in mind. Hence, a student is not above the teacher. Matthew's Gospel here reassures his readers, his listeners, that suffering was part of Jesus' life. So as they are struggling with the persecution, with the suffering they are experiencing, this is not alien to a Christian life. This doesn't mean that God has given up on them. A student is not above the teacher. In other words, crudely said, why should you fare any better than Jesus did? And then there's that verse that speaks of everything happening due to divine providence. It has often been taken out of context. What it's really saying here is that be comforted, looking to Christ, a sign of God's faithfulness when you are in peril. God has not given up on you, just as he hasn't given up on Jesus and raised him again to new life. Now, if you take this verse of God's providence out of context, you get into very hot water quickly, as though every car crash or illness or trivial event was part of God's providence, and it can become pious window dressing, which doesn't do justice to the realities of the world, as well as failing to appreciate the mystery that is God. The point that remains is that you are precious, valuable, loved by God. And then we see in the New Testament quite different groups of people who follow Jesus and support his mission in different ways. There are rich women who are part of the imperial household. There are slaves, there are wealthy urban dwellers, and we read about some of the tensions between rich and poor in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It appears that today's gospel passage has its roots in the movement of poor itinerant preachers and charismatic healers. They are the people to whom Jesus, in another passage, promises the new family of brothers and sisters who share houses and fields, part of a community that holds everything in common. It is not the hallmark of every Christian. Think of today. There are Christians who are part of a monastic community, Christians who risk life and limb in medical missions in war zones across the world, Christians who serve quietly and faithfully at some great cost in our local communities here, and we've heard a lot about that recently.
Of course, there is so much more that could be said, and this is just a short reflection. So where does this leave us? Jesus stands firmly in the prophetic tradition of protest against those promising false peace, against those that are just papering over the cracks of corporate sin. Today's Gospel is the cardinal antidote against an anodyne, mildly culturally entertaining expression of the Christian faith, which will never bring light in darkness, hope in despair, love into situations of hatred, or deep inspiration for the meaning of life.
In Bonhoeffer's words, cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ.
We will have each had very different experiences of the Christian faith on our journey through life. Easy experiences, difficult ones, costly ones, fun ones. And the question I want to ask today, the question as a take-home question really, is this: what does it cost me to be a Christian? Not as a question to beat yourself up, and the worse you feel, the better it's got to be. Not a question to make you think you need to be some perfect model kind of a Christian. But a question that tries to take seriously the experience of Christian people through the centuries, from Jesus onwards. What does it cost me to be a Christian?
God bless you as you seek to follow Christ this week.